All right, everyone. I want to thank everybody for coming to our webinar today. Sorry for the glitches here at the beginning of the webinar. We're going to run through a few slides, kind of talk a little bit about the agenda for today and who's on the call and everything. So we're going to have some people introduce themselves. But first, what we'd like to do is just talk about questions. The problem with government is we're not allowed to have people talking back and forth. So what we have to do is do questions, and you have to type in your questions. So if you have any questions, please pull up the questions menu there on the far right-hand side, or where your GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar information. Address the questions, and we'll try to get all the questions answered. If for some reason we do not get your question answered today, we will definitely get your question answered. So somebody from SiliconExpert or one of our panel members will be getting information back to you and answer any questions you might have. So a little bit about myself. My name is Bobby Holbrook. I'm Director of Sales for the Southeast region for SiliconExpert. I have my contact information right here. So if you, at any point, we'll have this at the end as well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'll answer any questions you might have. So what we're going to do for the agenda, do a SiliconExpert introduction. We're going to hand it off to Doug Leech and have him go through the state of play so far within the REACH community and the REACH initiatives. Then we're going to hand it off to Chris, and Chris is going to go through his presentation, and then we'll go through a short presentation about SiliconExpert and REACH compliance information we have, and then we'll open it up to any kind of questions and answers. So a little bit about SiliconExpert. So SiliconExpert provides, we're an information services company. We provide relevant data and insight information for the supply chain. So we're the leading for OEMs, distributors, and suppliers for the use for SiliconExpert on a daily basis. And our electronic components database powers our comprehensive support software tools, integrated solutions, as well as some professional services models that we have. So a little bit about our database. We have over 300 million parts, orderable part numbers. So what we state is anything that fits on a printed circuit board, we would track that information inside our tool. We have a comprehensive set of data elements. We are a data management system to acquire data and maintain the freshness of it. And then, of course, we've got over 400 engineers on the background of this database to keep it up to date. So we have a very large support team of domain experts to keep this information up to date. So again, our panelist today is Douglas Leech, and I'll have him talk a little bit about his background when he does his presentation. And then, of course, when we hand it over to Chris, we will talk about the panelists, and he can talk about his background on his side. So with that said, I'm going to hand this off to Douglas Leech now and have him jump right into there. So bear with me real quick while I do that.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see my slides now. I'll just drop that down. So I'm said earlier, I'm Doug Leech, Technical Director, Chemical Business Association, and I'm going to go through some of the state of play so far and some of the other technical aspects of the REACH regulation that's going on at the moment. Just as a general recap, as I said, last time we did this presentation in June. I haven't updated it since then, and these were the figures as of 5th of June, where you were talking of approximately 41,000 registrations have been done, which equate to around about 8,500 actual substances, of which 7,000 relate to the phase-in substances, so substances that were already on the system, already in INEX, already deemed as sort of, substances that people used, and then around about 1,300 are non-phase-in, so substances that fell outside that criteria. As you can see from this slide, the outlook for 2018 is a bit of a gap. Initial substances identified vary, but one of the figures that was put about was that there was 30,000 INEX phase-in substances that would be registered. That was from a list of about 110,000 in the initial stages. They reckon that only about 30,000 were actually being used. So far, 7,000 have been registered, so anybody simple maths can work out that actually we're missing a few substances. We're missing about 22,000 substances at the moment. So, with a pinch of salt, we think that substance withdrawal could be a reality. A lot of suppliers may not know until very late in the proceedings whether or not their materials are actually going to be registered or not. And a lot of this is down to a cost-benefit analysis, where a company will sit down and actually physically work out the economics of whether it's viable to continue running that product on their range or not. And for non-EU suppliers or people with non-EU suppliers, there tends to be a lack of visibility, because a lot of the time you've got no idea whether the non-EU supplier will actually go further or not. You're talking about very low tonnages. So, at the moment, the 2018 registration deadline is anything below, well, above 1 ton and below the 100 ton, which is the rump of the whole process, the small amount that's left. And, we just don't know which ones are going to occur or not. And often for non-EU suppliers, one of the biggest things is whether or not they're getting an effective only representative or not. And we've heard lots of stories about ineffective only representatives causing non-EU manufacturers problems, but also AWARs causing problems or causing issues because primarily the non-EU manufacturer is not passing the information across. So it's a very funny area at the moment with regard to what's going to happen and whether substances are going to go missing or not. So what we're suggesting, and what a lot of people are suggesting, and I know ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, are suggesting the same, is that people become proactive. Prepare, think ahead and plan. 2018 may sound a long way away. We're already halfway through 2015, and time is running away very fast. People need to be assessing whether or not they could have a registration obligation. What about substances that come from outside the EU area? Or do you understand whether your substances do actually come from there? You may buy it, for instance, you're in England and you buy it from Germany or France, but are they actually importing it from outside the EU? Where are these materials coming from? Have a look at your supply chain. Try and have a look and see how complex it is. And it is difficult to do this, and I know that Airbus and a lot of other of the aviation people have done this sort of supply chain complexity, because their supply chains are very complex. They have materials going everywhere. And then you need to sort of try and get an idea on what will you do if you experience a withdrawal. Is this substance absolutely vital to your process? Are you aware of whether or not there are alternatives to it, or there are alternative suppliers, or there are alternative sources, etc.? And are your key suppliers vulnerable? So try and get that sort of information, have a look, try and figure out what's going on. Talk to your suppliers. A lot of people feel that actual communication up and down the supply chain is something that shouldn't really happen very much unless it's to do with prices and quality and things like that. But REACH is critical to a lot of companies where they need to know whether the chemical has or has not been registered. So for instance, niche chemicals. You depend on this chemical, for instance, anti-corrosion coatings, chromates, etc. Aviation rely on that, so they know that that's a niche chemical that they need to control, they need to understand what's going on. Try and understand your supplier's registry intentions. They will not tell you whether they're going to pull out or not, but you may be able to talk to them, and you may be able to do something with them and work with them to get the material registered, and maybe even come halfway with regard to fees, etc., and costs. If it's vital, work with them, because if they will register, great, but if they won't register, what are you going to do? How do you understand it? And then the other one is use. When they register, are they going to register the use? Have you told your supplier what you actually use this material from, and that they come back to you and said, yes, we understand that, we know that's the use you use, and we're going to cover that, yes or no. You know, because you need to know that, because you maybe need to start planning and putting something else in place. The candidate list was updated in June, so for everybody who's manufacturing articles, 2 new substances were added to the candidate list, so it's now 163 substances long. So, you know, this is where you start getting the various different inquiries where people are asking you what SVHC substances are in your materials. So you need to keep an eye on the candidate list on a regular basis and see what's happening with that. There are 31 substances actually now in the authorization annex, Annex 14, as you can see that the figures there. 5th recommendation was forwarded to the Commission. I know Chris is going to talk about the 6th because we've mentioned it here, you know, and other ones we were still a little bit in the dark exactly what was going on and when this was going to go from the European Commission to ECHA. But these are substances that will then go on to the authorization annex or Annex 14. And as you can see from the figure here that I've got, that the additional of the 6th recommendation would have increased it to 53 substances that would be on the annex. There has been a little bit of a delay in the whole process with regard to the 5th and 6th, primarily because there's been some work going on in the background about risk management measures, RMOA, and PACT and various things like that, where they've been trying to find alternative methods of controlling chemicals, because I think people were starting to get a bit worried that authorization in itself was controlling a lot of chemicals and people weren't looking at the broader picture, and maybe they were spending a lot of resources on authorization when actually authorization is not the best tool in the box to do the process. So part of the reason the whole of this has been delayed is because they didn't really want to start pushing things forward if there wasn't a good justification behind it. So, you know, it's been a bit slow. It's still going, and as I said, Chris will talk slightly later on about one part of it. There is some hidden slides, so when you get the slide pack, you will see some hidden slides with regard to various bits, and you know, but there was just no need to actually talk over them, so I just hid them and left them in the background. Applications have been steadily moving along. As you can see from this slide, you've got around about 44 applications had been received by June, and of that covered, 28 applications received for 44 applicants, which covered 56 different uses, and then various ones had gone across to the Risk Assessment Committee and the Socio-Economic Committee, and there's been various different opinions published, and then there's been a few authorizations that actually have been granted. And as you can see, these are the substances that we had as of that date that have been put forward, and authorization applications have actually been put into the system. And the red ones on the end, as you can see, 6, are actual decisions that have been made per use per applicant by the Commission, and these applications have actually been issued and given. But as you can see, primarily you've got 3 phthalates in there, then you've got a couple of lead chromate pigments, and then you start going into flame retardants and various other aspects. The first one, which everybody's aware of, was the Rolls-Royce one to do with turbine blades and various things. As you can see, that was issued around about getting towards this time last year, and it's got a review period of February 22. So, you know, not very long, just under 8 years, 7.5-ish, 8 years given for them to find. They can either go back and apply for another authorization and to continue it, or they've got to find alternatives of various things. Second one, Huntsman, that, as you can see, is 2027, but that's actually a chemical manufacturing process. So I think they've been given a little bit longer than that to try and make sure that they're not going to be disadvantaged and they're going to be able to continue the material. You've then got a rocket motor one because it was there, but as you can see, that was only given about 4 years for them to do work on. And then the arsenic trioxide, as you can see again, that's only been given around about 2 years. So the expiry date for the actual authorization, as you can see, can vary depending on the information that's been put forward in the dossier and in the actual application itself. With regard to trichloroethylene, as you can see on there, trichloroethylene, at the time of writing this, 13 draft opinions had been passed to the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee for them to look at it to see whether or not the loss of this material would have a big economic or social impact with regard to the whole process. That covered around about 19 uses. There was a lot more uses put forward for this material. I think people are trying to figure out what they're going to do, and the Socioeconomic or the Risk Assessment Committee had not refused any of them uses as of that date. As I said, I've been away for a couple of days, so haven't had a chance to go back and have a proper look and see whether there's been any changes to that. And then we've got one of the first use of one of the chromates, which was a use, and it was a draft opinion that's been again sent to the Socioeconomic. But this is for use in a very, very specific process, and it's naval decoys that will contain munitions. And the idea is that corrosion protection is vital because you don't want this material exploding early or various things like that. It's there for a certain role, and so they've put together this process in this case for this one very specific use. And we can see that in the future this is the way that a lot of this is actually going to go, is that you're going to actually have a lot of very, very specific uses put forward for a lot of these materials, because they need to be more tight and specific to get them through the process. As you can see, restriction is one part actually of the REACH process that a lot of people miss. R, registration, E, evaluation, A, authorization, and then the CH is chemicals. But the authorization is authorization and restriction of chemicals, and a lot of people miss this. It's nothing new. It's something that's been around since the mid-70s. It was part of what was called the Marketing and Use Directive, and the Marketing and Use Directive was actually absorbed into REACH as of 1st of June 2009. And so as of that date, it now became part of the whole process. And if you use that web link, you can go on and you can get access to the actual processes. This one's different from authorization. Authorization, we often say, is a cudgel or a club, and basically it says this material, the use, sale, etc. is banned from this date unless you have an application specifically allowing you to use the material for a certain use or application, etc. Restriction tends to work the other way around. It's almost a case of you cannot use the material for this, but you can use it for anything else. So unless it's mentioned in the restriction list as not being able to be used for that process, then you can continue using it. Part of the reason why we put it in, because as you can see, there's a few restriction discussions ongoing or have actually been sort of put forward to various different processes. So Deca BDE, flame retardant material, the Regulatory Assessment Committee has agreed its opinion. It's forwarded to the Socioeconomic Assessment Committee, and there's comments about a blanket restriction because these materials, these types of flame retardants, aren't liked at all. They're the brominated ones, and there's evidence starting to grow that they shouldn't be used over a certain concentration. So that's what's been put forward. With regard to PFOA, the fluorinated material, discussions have started, but at the time they were only very basic discussions, and we were hearing comments that they're definitely going to be talking about this in September and November, so it's possibly going to be next year before anything starts to appear with regard to this material. But we are hearing a lot of comments that people are going to have problems if some of these disappear. So it's going to be a discussion, and we'll see how it goes. The last one that you can see on there is methanol, and methanol is a basic sort of process, but it's a dossier talking about restricting methanol, and it's likely to take a bit more time. With regard to the future, there's an implementing act going through. The implementing act is trying to control data sharing because the Commission and Member States are a little bit concerned with some of the stories they've been hearing with regards to data sharing and some of the issues. This isn't backed up as much in the data sharing disputes, but what we are hearing is that a lot of companies just feel that they can't argue with larger companies, etc. So why don't you just back off and just either not sell the material anymore, or maybe source it from somewhere else. So there's lots of issues bubbling around about this, and there isn't a lot of data sharing disputes coming around. But these are some of these are the facts that have been put forward with regard to the data sharing disputes and some of the reasons why data sharing disputes have been voted in favour of the claimant. So no cost breakdown, no cost sharing mechanism available so you understand what you're doing, no explanation of costs, they don't communicate in a timely manner or don't even reply, so you send an email and nothing comes back. So there's various different issues about this, and one of the things that we often say is you wouldn't buy a car if you didn't know what the spec came with and what the cost was going to be to cover that spec and any add-ons or bits that you needed to do. Why should this be any different? You need to be aware that the software will change at the beginning of next year. As I said, they're bringing out a new REACH IT, the portal that you actually put the REACH registration dossiers through. They're redoing Euclid 6 or Euclid 5 and producing Euclid 6, and the beta version is already available on the ECHA website for people to have a play with and have a trial and see what they think about it, because they're asking for feedback. And then you've got CHASAR, which is the safety assessment tool. That's been updated to go with the other two as well. So that's early next year. General advice that we're giving people is you need to be doing things now. I know this is the 2013 timeline, but if you look at the 2013 timeline and replace the last date, 31st of May 2013, with 2018, then you can work back and figure out when actually people should be starting to do their various parts. So as you can see, by the end of March, ECHA would suggest that the lead registrant had done their submission. By December 2017, the chemical safety assessment should have been done. So really, you're talking about the substance ID, etc., should be working along in 2016. So you've got only around about sort of 6 months or so to start to get your head around exactly what it is you're going to do, and time is ticking away each time. Because we're saying start soon, because as you can see from this, there's a bit of a log jam of everybody trying to get through the same tunnel at the same time. We're already hearing stories that there may not be enough consultants available, and there may not be enough time to perform tests, because some of these materials may not even have the basic physiochemical or various other tests that you need to put forward. They may never have ever been done. So if they haven't been done, you've got to do them. And so then you've got to find a test lab, because they've all got to be done under good lab practice conditions. So there's a few issues starting to go. And then you've got your increase in cost because simple supply and demand economics. If there's not enough consultants, they're going to be able to charge higher premium prices to get you through and get you through fast and get you into the process. So these are the sort of things that we're going to get and we're going to see. These are some slides that came courtesy of EF, and as you can see, what they did was they started asking chemical users, so not the actual manufacturers, they were asking downstream users and trying to find out their knowledge with regard to REACH. And as you can see, the smaller the firm, the less awareness they are, or the less aware they are of REACH. And the blue one at the far end is your micro businesses up to £2 million, and not applicable, not important. Around about 60 to 65% believe that REACH wasn't applicable and didn't affect them at all. So, you know, there is a basic awareness, and then when you start going into some of the understanding, you know, those that understood, which was very small, what they were concerned about. REACH is very complex. The impact of cost was one, cost to the business, impacts on their supply chain, authorizations pretty high up there, and the impact on availability or ability to innovate. And this is something that we're hearing on a regular basis. And so the companies are planning, and we're aware that some companies are planning to withdraw substances from the market. You know, this was 33% said my company is aware of suppliers who will be withdrawn certain substances from the market as a result of these requirements. And then, as you can see, a small number of companies said they were planning on withdrawing something because of it. And it's primarily the rubber and chemical sector or the transport sector where withdrawals seem to be more of a given, where people realize things were going to go missing. And you know, only half the companies that were surveyed by EF were actually sort of prepared for something. As you can see, 18%, my company is not aware of this. 23% said don't know. So you only had the 23 and 33% of company where some of them were actually starting to be aware that there was a situation and that REACH may cause them a problem in the future, and they were sort of starting to, well, 33% were taking action and the rest were just knew it was of concern but hadn't actually started to put anything in place yet. So it's not a totally doom or gloom picture, but what the whole process is really people need to be preparing, people need to be looking at their systems, people need to be really looking at their chemicals, figuring out what chemicals they have in the parts or in the various other bits that they have, which ones are vital to them, and then work out a strategy, if they can, of what they could actually do after that. Right, so what I'll do is I'll now hand over to Chris, and Chris can do his section, and then we can have questions afterwards. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Doug. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are today. I will just take over the screen. You should currently see a blank screen, I think. And if I do that, Doug, can you confirm that you can see that? Then hopefully everybody else can.
I can confirm. There you go.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, good. As I say, hello, and thanks very much, Doug, for providing a very insightful context. My name is Chris Robertson, Head of Regulatory Compliance at Edif ERA. Just to say a little bit about who we are. We're a regulatory compliance consultancy, amongst other things. There's a much larger organisation than that nowadays, now that we're part of Edif rather than just ERA. But we kind of work mostly in the spheres of producers of products. So it's kind of downstream from where Doug mostly works, and where there is even less knowledge of what REACH means and its implications. And Doug has just been expressing. So we work mostly in that sphere. And I'd just like to point out one thing to you, that our conference in November is coming up, which is very popular and covers all these sorts of issues. And we just published the program. So if you look on our website, you can see who's speaking. Doug is one of them, incidentally, I'm pleased to say. So what I would just cover is how you get to something like restriction, what the roadmap is. Sometimes it's quite complicated, and I think it's worth just kind of setting out how that works. A little bit about how SVHCs are growing and how they're going to grow, where SVHCs are used, and a little bit of feedback that we have from a webinar we did at the back end of last year. The latest on uses of SVHCs. I'm adding in a little bit about some changes between the June webinar we did for SiliconExpert and this one, and then finishing off with some stuff on one particular restriction and the thing that everybody loves if they make articles, which is article with a capital A, 33, of REACH, and how to provide information according to that. Okay, so this is a roadmap of how you get from a proposal to do something with a substance, regulatory or otherwise, to the point of having regulated or not. And you can see that there's the front end of this is the member states or the European Commission, ECHA on behalf of the European Commission, making some sort of proposal. And the outcome of that can be something we've already talked about, like restriction, so that's Annex 17, or it which stops you using it in articles, for example, or it might be a substance being put onto Annex 14, which doesn't stop it from being used in an article if the article is produced outside the EU. So it's actually imbalanced against the EU manufacturing of articles, sadly, from an EU perspective. One outcome might be that no further action is actually taken by the EU, or some other measure might be taken, like being proposed to be as a persistent organic pollutant under the Stockholm Convention, or maybe workplace exposure limits. And there's a process between the proposal by the member state or ECHA and the outcome. First of all, substances go into the registry of intentions. Then there's various outcomes, and one of which is that it may go onto the candidate list of substances of very high concern. And everything, all that information is publicly available on the ECHA website, and there's an awful lot of it. But it's worth just mentioning that there's a sort of stuff happens before this. In particular, how does a substance get proposed in the first place? Well, there are external influences. There's data and various parties who are inclined to push that data, either technical institutes or governments, member states in the UK or France or whoever, or maybe outside, like US. There might be other third parties like ChemSec, for example, who produce a SIN list, other NGOs, non-governmental organisations. So there's quite a few influences of putting substances or prioritising substances. Latterly, we've had two processes which have come into being. One is the Public Activities Coordination Tool, or PACT, and the other one is the Rolling Action Evaluation Programme called CORAP. And together they represent a means of assessing substances, screening substances, and coming to an initial view as to what action should be taken. And there's well over 100 substances are being looked at under PACT. And so you can even look even earlier in the process to see what may be coming up the line in terms of some sort of regulatory action. This is all in the public domain. So if we just think a little bit about substances of very high concern, which they go onto the candidate list, called a candidate list because they're candidates for going onto Annex 14, which would stop them being manufactured or used as chemicals in the EU. Then that's been growing over time, and here's a little graph which shows you what's been happening. So this all started off back in about 2008 when the first few were put on the list of SVHCs, and that's this little orange box on the left-hand side. And that's gradually grown over time such that, as Doug said, there's now 163 SVHCs, some of which have gone forward to be placed on Annex 14, which is the red box. So there's 31 substances represented by that red box in 2015. There's some substances which have been put forward for putting onto Annex 14, some SVHCs which have been put forward, and then there are substances which are SVHCs, so they're kind of in the waiting room, but they have not been taken into the doctor's surgery, as it were. And that's where the kind of hiatus really is at the moment about how you do that process, particularly for low volume uses. There's been a small change between June and July, and if you watch very carefully, you'll see the boxes change. There you go. There's another handful of substances. 7 more SVHCs were put forward onto the Registry of Intentions, and 15 more substances have been proposed for Annex 14. In fact, they were already in the process for or being considered for that. This is just the formally being put forward by ECHA for that purpose. And the green boxes, worth us dwelling on. Back in 2012 or so, ECHA said we intend to grow this list by up to 578 substances by 2020, or 440 substances more than were the case back in 2011, I think, actually. And you can see that the process is running quite a long way behind what was intended. There was a big jump to 2012 to meet a particular deadline that they wanted to hit, but since then things have really slowed down. But the intention is clear, which is to grow this list significantly, and once the process has been ironed out, I think would be prudent to expect that the process will accelerate again. And a lot of substances are taken to bear in mind or to take into account. So what substances of very high concern have been added since Doug and I did this event for SiliconExpert last year? Well, we've got these SVHCs which are intended, which have been just added in the last few days, published on the ECHA website. And as you can see, I've got to group them by uses. The 2 camphor substances are used in cosmetics to absorb ultraviolet light. Somewhat similarly, there are 2 UV absorbers used in polymeric applications, particularly, or flexible applications, and phenol-based compounds. And in fact, there are already a couple of SVHCs which have got UV codes, which are further along the process than those. A lot of you will probably be aware of bisphenol A and the concerns about that, and that actually moves to restrict bisphenol A in receipts produced by printers in shops because of the contact that staff in particular have with the material, endocrine disruptor. And you can see, interestingly, that there are a couple of bisphenol family substances, bisphenol F, bisphenol AF there, and bisphenol F may be used as a substitute for bisphenol A, which is interesting in that it's just a warning, if you like, that if looking for alternatives for a substance which is looking like it's going to be regulated in some way, you've got a bit of a frying pan into the fire scenario. If you jump from bisphenol A to bisphenol F, then maybe you're going to end up having to jump from bisphenol F to something else again. So having some understanding of similarity of properties and what's coming up the track is really quite sensible. Yes, so that's just a little review of latest intentions. Thinking a bit about SVHCs, which are now existing SVHCs, which have been put forward to for Annex 14. Batch 6 was recently published in the last few days, and that's another 15 substances being put forward. And I haven't put all the names up here because it wouldn't all fit on the slide and I wouldn't have time to talk about it, but you can see them on the ECHO website. And I've just given you an idea of some uses here, from the point of view particularly of downstream users. So we've got one more solvent being added, we've got a surfactant, we've got 7 plasticizers, so that's 7 more phthalates, and there's already over 10 phthalates in the process, and I think we're looking for huge numbers of phthalates being regulated in some way under REACH, and several of them are already on Annex 14. So it's the process goes on with phthalates. Phthalates are used in many polymers, PVC for example, to stop them cracking. There's some niche things in there as well. There's anthracene, oil, and pitch, which tend to be used in many applications in electronics anyway, and engineering. Perhaps worth mentioning the boric acid, disodium tetraborate, anhydrous, and diboron trioxide, and tetraboron disodium heptoxide hydrate. And there's a bunch of 4 boron-based compounds which are being put forward for Annex 14. Boric acid, for example, has got a wide range of uses, like it's used in the manufacturing of glass. In fact, some of them, the other ones are as well. It's used in brazing fluxes, in electroplating, to produce nickel, for example, to make furnace refractories, and it's used in lubricants and fertilizers. And so, as you can see, there is significant interest in these substances because they could be used in engineering products. If that's your sector, then these substances could be being squeezed out. Last year we put up this graph, and it's tweaked slightly just to give you an idea of how many SVHCs are actually used in engineering products. And we've identified a handful of more uses of the existing SVHCs. A few more SVHCs have been added, but not many. And we reckon now that about half of them are used in engineering products. Other ones are used to make engineering products. So the 76 in red there does not include things like solvents, which wouldn't generally be found in the final product because they would evaporate or be washed off or something. So are SVHCs of relevance to the engineering community? Is there an obsolescence issue with SVHCs? Clearly the answer is yes. Not every SVHC is used in every application, but a lot of them are used quite ubiquitously. So, yeah, at the back end of last year, we carried out a webinar for compliance and risks, and there are about 300 people on that webinar. And we asked them this question: how's REACH affecting you? Are there kind of pressures on for phase out of substances as far as you're concerned? And of those on the call, 32% said they didn't know. And bear in mind that those who are on the call, like yourselves, are people who are well informed and briefed insofar as you consider REACH a sufficient interest to take part in an event like this. Those who don't consider it to be an issue, as highlighted by Doug's poll, would be less knowledgeable than yourselves, or the results of this poll. A similar sort of demographic, I would have thought. So 32% didn't know. 61% said they were changing their designs to avoid substances of very high concern, which makes a lot of sense because it just takes you out of the regulatory loop if you do. 45%, rather oddly, said they were changing their designs to avoid Annex 14 substances, which is kind of slightly curious in that they are subject to more regulation, and in particular that use them to make products in the EU as chemicals, or you can't manufacture the chemicals. So one would have expected it to have been the other way around. But nevertheless, there's some knowledge there that SVHCs are used, and you need to take an interest in whether you're going to be able to continue to use them or not. Bearing in mind that an SVHC is not banned from use in articles, and nor is it banned when it's on Annex 14 if the article is made outside the EU. So you can carry on using it if you can get hold of the SVHC. Perhaps the most interesting one is actually this little red blob. 9% of those on the call said they were moving processes or supply outside of the EU. So if perhaps you're having difficulties in sourcing in the EU, things like hexavalent and chromium coatings, for example, this would be kind of somewhere. This is a clue to that, perhaps, and it's perhaps surprising that that number isn't bigger, but perhaps it's also the case that some people haven't realized that this is an issue, and it's not going to happen as an issue to them until their supplier will stop supplying for them. As Doug has sort of highlighted, there's a potential time bomb there, and we just don't know what the size of the charge is. Moving on my screen updates. It's trying to. Oops. There we go. Okay, SVHC's additions since 2014. Well, there's only been a handful, as you can see. We've got the couple of UV stabilizers I mentioned are already further along the process, and now that they are now SVHCs as opposed to intended as SVHCs, which was in the previous list a few slides ago. Couple of heat stabilizers and yet another of the phthalate plasticizers. So only a short list, but all of those are significant. In fact, there are 8 SVHCs in all. There was also a fragrance, and there are also a couple of cadmium compounds which aren't used in articles in general, so I'm not talking about those here. But there were 8 in all. Yeah, so just to say a little bit about cadmium. Cadmium has been restricted in the EU for a long time. It was restricted under the Marketing Use Directive, which was subsumed as Annex 17 into REACH. It was restricted in specific polymers. It's item 23 in Annex 17. But there was an error made in 2012 where cadmium in all polymers was restricted briefly according to the legal text, but the mistake was corrected. But when the mistake was corrected, the amended text said that the EU would look to assess if a wider restriction was possible, which they did. And so a study has been carried out to see if this were possible. Quite a few member states, some NGOs were quite keen that this were so. And the results of this were published earlier this year. And the interesting thing is that no new restrictions were proposed after this assessment because insufficient evidence was found to actually support further restriction. Essentially, what the study found was that where cadmium is used, it's used in those applications which are where it's required for safety and reliability issues, particularly where there is a current allowance under item 23 of Article 17, and it wasn't really being used in the sorts of wide applications which would have been concerned, and there was difficulty getting hold of evidence which would support any further restrictions. So it's possible that this will be reconsidered at some point, but at the moment there's no move to widen the restriction of cadmium beyond the polymers that it currently covers, things like PVC and PET, PVT, but it doesn't cover, for example, things like ABS or PMMA. So there are polymers where it is allowed to be used, even apart from the safety and reliability allowance. Oh yeah, I pressed too far. This is my last slide, as you can tell, as I've just gone to the last one. The issue which I think is challenging most manufacturers of articles or suppliers of articles is Article 33, capital A. The article of REACH, called Article 33, deals with providing information to your supplier, to your recipient of how much SVHC is in the article if it's present above 0.1%. So I'll correct myself. The name of an SVHC if it's present above 0.1%. You don't have to provide the concentration, though some people would like you to provide it, and any information that you need to provide to ensure safe use. And there's a standoff at the moment between ECHA and most member states who consider this 0.1% of the article as supplied, and some member states like France and Germany, for example, who take the view that it's 0.1% of an article from the point of view of, from the time when you actually produce an article. So say, for example, you're providing a laptop computer, ECHA would say it's 0.1% by weight of the laptop computer, and France would say it's 0.1% by weight of the fuse, for example, in the laptop computer, because the fuse is a separate article within the laptop itself. This standoff exists still, and it was passed to the Advocate General, and they provided a view which is kind of confusing in that they tend to side with the once an article and always an article grouping, which is France and so on, but it's still not agreed. What is the case is that if eventually it does fall on that side, then there'll be a lot more work that suppliers of articles have to do to provide information, because the dilution effect that comes from putting, let's say, for example, a fuse into a laptop will no longer apply. So more information will be required from the supply chain. So we have to watch that space at the moment. And that's it from me, and I hope you found that useful. And it's back to Lily, I think.
Thank you, Chris. Bobby, it looks like we have a couple more minutes. I'm going to make you the presenter now. It looks like we don't have any questions come in yet, but if you guys have any questions, please send them over through the questions screen, and we'll answer them via email.
So as you can see here, I'm on slide 51, if you were wondering. As you can see here, we did a search on an LM317. As you can see, when we do the search on that, it shows you all the parts that are associated with the LM317. The next slide over, this is where we've clicked on the part on the LM317 Fairchild part, and we show you all the information that we're collecting at the environmental level. So you can see lead-free, ELV, RoHS, any kind of exemptions when it comes to RoHS, as well as the REACH and SVHC information. The next slide down, slide 53, shows you the SVHC list, and then also if it contains any SVHCs and if there's any SVHCs that exceeds the threshold, with backup documentation from the supplier. The next slide down would be the full declaration information. So now we're pulling down the full chemical breakdown to the part, all the way to the homogeneous materials, the substance mass, the CAS numbers, and then also the parts per million information. So a lot of information at the part level. The next slide is where you can set up an alert notification to alert you when something goes sideways on one of the environmental compliancy information. So for instance, we send out alert notification on RoHS changes, REACH changes, and SVHC changes. So you can upload your bills of materials in our solution and then also receive alert notifications when something changes on one of those different environmental compliancy information. And then the next one down would be a report. So we allow you to upload bills of materials and then also download a report at the BOM level. And then as you can see here, we're showing you the REACH report. So we show you whether it contains SVHCs, if it exceeds the threshold, what conversion date that we're utilizing, as well as the source and the type and the backup documentation. So when you download this report, you can be able to see the URL within inside an Excel file of the backup source documentation. And then something new that we've added this year would be our roll-up. So we just added this. This is something new that we've just added, is the ability to take your bill of material, upload it inside the system, and then be able to do a roll-up. And within inside that roll-up, you can do that. It allows you to look at an overview at the SVHC status. It shows you statistics at the total mass and the SVHC levels at the BOM, the part level, and the supplier level. And what's also great about it is it highlights all the components that exceeds SVHCs and looks at the list of the conversion dates at this level. So it's a great tool to be able to look at it and kind of look at a high-level roll-up solution and be able to look at all of your parts and where they fit into the different levels associated with it. And then the next one would be our question and answer session. So I think I'm going to kick this back over to Lily because I know there were some questions that came in, and I'll have Lily kind of read out those questions, and we'll get those questions answered for you today.
Okay, so it just looks like we have one question, and this is either directed to either Doug or Chris. Is there anywhere where there's a consolidated list of substances, both current and future, which we could audit against in our manufacturing process?
Chris here. I would say no. There are miscellaneous lists depending on ECHA have got lists to do with Annex 14, Annex F17, or substances which are on their way to that. Various trade associations, for example, would have their own lists. Different manufacturers have lists. But unfortunately, the long and short of it is there is no list that I know of.
The only list that I can mention was the appendices to the original REACH regulation, and in the appendices 1 to 6 it mentioned the C, M and R materials that were identified as being a CM and CMR as it stood then. But there has been new data published. Some new substances have been found to be more environmentally friendly, so you've ended up with the PBT. And then there's the other information, unfortunately, where you have certain decisions that have been made by ECHA and backed up by the European Court about other types of material under the Article 57 sort of substance of equivalent concern or endocrine disruptors. So unfortunately, no, there isn't one nice sort of resource where you can go and find everything in one go.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's a good list insofar as that if you want to know which what are SVHCs, leaving aside endocrine disruptors and substances of equivalent concern, then that's the list to go to. If you can stop using all of those, then you're going a long way.
Yeah.
But of course, not all of them necessarily end up on the candidate list.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris and Doug. I apologize for everyone for going over a couple minutes, but I just want to remind everyone that we do have a survey at the end of the webinar that we would appreciate if you fill out. Again, I want to thank everybody from SiliconExpert and on Chris and Doug's behalf for attending. We had a couple questions come in as well, so we'll be following up with you via email at the end. Thank you, everyone, again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.